Bruce Pascoe is a Bunurong, Yuin and Tasmanian man born in the Melbourne suburb of Richmond and graduating from Melbourne University with a Bachelor of Education. Forgive me for wearing my glasses on the end of my nose, but I can't see with the light otherwise. He's a member of the Warrazum Aboriginal Cooperative of Southern Victoria and has been the director of the Australian Studies Project for the Commonwealth Schools Commission. Bruce is also a board member of the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation for Language. Now, Bruce has had a very varied career. He's been a teacher, a farmer, a fisherman, barman, fencing contractor, lecturer, Aboriginal language researcher, archaeological site worker and editor. Now, his book, Foxadox, won the young adult category of the 2013 Prime Minister's Literary Awards, and his most recent book is called Dark Emu, Black Seeds, Agriculture or Accident, which won the New South Wales Premier's Book of the Year Award in 2016. Now, over the last couple of years, Bruce's research has involved Indigenous history and language revival. From the journals and records of early explorers and surveyors, Bruce has accumulated some astonishing descriptions of a pre-colonial Aboriginal life. Early explorers such as Thomas Mitchell and Charles Sturt, among others, described scenes all around the country of Aboriginal people engineering sophisticated dwellings and irrigation systems. They also describe the cultivation of vast areas of land for yam fields and also the harvesting, storage and milling of grain crops. Now, with more details of these remarkable findings, please welcome Bruce Pascoe.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for the welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of the area where you're now sitting, and I'd like to thank them for allowing me to speak on their country. There's a little thing you do with children, at least I did it with my children, where you scroll your finger round through the palm of your hand and you ask them, can you keep a secret? I don't suppose you can. Well, we certainly can in Australia. We've kept a secret very, very well for a very, very long time. And it's about what Aboriginal people were doing to manage the land in Australia when those first European so-called explorers saw when they entered Aboriginal land. Because they saw Aboriginal people sowing grain, reaping grain, and storing the produce. And in Mitchell's words, Sir Thomas Mitchell, when he was riding through the grainlands that Aboriginal people had prepared on the New South Wales-Queensland border, as it is now, Mitchell described riding through 9 miles of stooped grain. Any Australian history student who has graduated at any period in Australian history has probably not heard that word stoop, which is reference to Aboriginal people. The word stoop should alarm us, the fact that we haven't heard it in relation to Aboriginal people, because a stoop is a group of sheaves of grain standing on their end, and Mitchell rode through 9 miles of stooped grain, and the grassland that had not been harvested stretched right back to the horizon as far as he could see. This is an enormous field of harvest. This is an enormous dedication of labour to the production of food. And it so flies in the face of the idea of Aboriginal people merely wandering around the face of the earth, hunting and gathering. Aboriginal people did hunt, we still do. We did gather, we still do. But we also conducted agriculture in the production of food, and we still do. And it wasn't just Mitchell who saw these things, because Lieutenant Grey in the fields of Western Australia being the first European into that area, Ray came across areas that were so deeply tilled, he couldn't walk across them. Tilled. Like the word stoop, we should be alarmed by the fact that we never heard of that word in the whole of our Australian history. Tilled. Aboriginal people were tilling the ground so deeply that you couldn't walk across it. And those yam fields that Gray noticed stretched to the horizon in both directions. And it wasn't just one, because it took him a day and a half to walk around one. He'd already lost his horses. Now, this is, he was the second worst explorer in Australia. The story of how he lost his horses would take a day and a half. We haven't got time. But he had no horses, so he had to walk around this field, and he got to a rise at the end of one of those fields. He stood on the rise, looked south, and saw another one. And that happened to him several times. And he also saw within those fields roads. He saw wells, and he saw log houses. The houses were so well built, the logs were so heavy that it would take 3 or 4 men to lift them, or 2 or 3 women. They were big dwellings in anyone's words, and we know nothing about them in Australian history. We continually read about Aboriginal people wandering around, going from one berry to another berry, one kangaroo to another kangaroo. Why are we not hearing about Aboriginal people conducting agriculture in the land? Those people in Western Australia were harvesting a yam, and its last name is hastifolia. You know, it's a particular yam, and its production and harvesting has a particular technique which required Aboriginal people to dig quite deeply into the soil, and that produced the kind of gardening or farming that Lieutenant Gray had seen. And it's a really important fact of Australia that they were digging deeply to get to the root which they favoured, because this is Australia. It's a dry land. They had to dig deeply to get to that root. People who had tried to grow this tuber more recently were thought they had failed, because when they went to dig up the tuber, it didn't appear to be there. So they brought in a backhoe, and they dug with a backhoe. They still couldn't find the tuber. They thought they'd failed. Eventually, they got down deep enough, and there they were, these wonderful yams sheltering from the heat of Western Australia. This marvellous produce in this marvellous land required a marvellously innovative agriculture. And we can grow these today. Aboriginal people in WA are growing them today. And the old girls had to teach non-Aboriginal people how to harvest them. You have to dig. And those people that Lieutenant Gray saw had been working a face in the ground, digging deeply to uncover this produce. And we need to know about that. In Melbourne, the original European farmers who came from England with some farming skills, not everybody did, they witnessed that all the hillsides of Melbourne had been terraced. They wrote down the word terrace. How come in the whole history of Australia we don't nothing about the word terrace? Because terrace talks about digging, about creation, about investment of labour. And we just don't want to know about it in this country. We don't want to hear about tilling. We don't want to hear about stooks. We don't want to hear about terraces. This is Australian history. This is the history that belongs to the land. It doesn't belong to Aboriginal people. It doesn't belong to non-Aboriginal people. It belongs to the land, to the Mother Earth. And we have to be true to her. Forget about ourselves for a moment, think about the land, because those old Aboriginal people had worked out a system of agriculture which was true to the land, which looked after the land. Think for a moment about the mallee in Victoria. When I was a kid, the red soil of the mallee blew over my house for 5 years in a row. I've only ever lived in a city for 5 years, but in those 5 years, the mallee went past my ears because people were ploughing soil that should never have been ploughed. And this was just flying in the face of what you could read in the soil. It was bad farming practice. We destroyed the mallee soils because we wanted some kind of progress at any cost. And this cost us our soil. And we're still doing that. We have to learn from the history. We have to learn what Charles Sturt learnt when his life was saved in what we now call the dead heart of Australia. Sturt was dying. Most of his horses were dead. Some of his fellows were dead. Sturt was dying. He had scurvy. They hadn't been eating their vegetables and fruit because they didn't have any. They knew nothing about the Aboriginal fruits and vegetables that they passed every day. If they had, they wouldn't have gone blind. Anyway, at last, they're literally on their last legs. They're standing on a sand dune, looking down into a valley, and in his bleary state, Sturt makes out a whole lot of people in the valley below him. They're the local Aboriginal people, and they're waving and shouting. They've never seen a white man. They've never seen a horse. And yet they urge the explorers, the so-called explorers, to come down into the valley. And those people hold out coolamons of water that they had drawn from their own well, and they offer it to the explorers. And then, in a great act of grace, they turn around and offer it to the horses, an animal they have never seen. The whiskers of the horses touch those people's fingers, and yet they stand there staunchly because they recognise in the horse a fellow being, and they want its comfort. Then those people turn back to the explorers and they offer them roast duck and cake. These aren't a people living on the bones of their behinds. These people are prospering in what we now call the harsh conditions of the centre of Australia, the dead heart of Australia, the desert. These people had sown down a riverbed with seed, taking advantage of the ephemeral river. When it began to dry, they sowed grain into the riverbed, came back, harvested that, turned it into flour, and made, in Sturt's words, the lightest and sweetest cakes he had ever tasted. Now, with all our cooking shows, 503 to my last count, that appear on Australian radio, TV and newspapers, none has ever mentioned the lightest and sweetest cakes an Englishman has ever tasted. Why are we doing that? Why don't we mention stoops? Why don't we mention tilling? Why don't we mention terraces? And why don't we mention sublime food? It's a good question, Bruce. Thanks for asking it. I'll now attempt to answer my own question. I think we're gun shy in this country. We're gun shy of talking about how the land came to be in the possession of Europeans. We're gun shy about admitting Aboriginal achievement. And so we tell ourselves a history which is nonsense. It's unbelievable. German, Italian, French visitors to Australia, they don't believe it for a minute. They burst into laughter when they're told the Australian version of Australian history. They say that's impossible. People don't act like that. That's not how history works. They know that history, from their experience, progresses on the back of murder and barbarity, and usually Christianity. And so they're not fooled for a minute about Australian history, but we are, we Australians. We believe a child's version of history, and it's crippling us. It's crippling our minds. It's crippling the way we negotiate with Aboriginal people. If we believed the true history of Australia, we'd be revering those grains and tubers because they're Australian plants. I know it's a really radical idea to talk about growing Australian plants in Australia. It's heresy, isn't it? They all have to come from the Northern Hemisphere, don't they? But these plants want to grow here. And if we could, just for a moment, turn our attention to the real history of the country, we'd discover this other gold mine, the flora of Australia and the food that it produces. The little murnon, the tuber that Mitchell was describing, is only that big. But it's 7 times as nutritious as a potato, so you don't have to eat as much of it. So it's going to be better for your health anyway because you're not eating volume. And it's highly nutritious. Its sugar isn't a sugar at all. It's fructose, so it's very, very easy for diabetics to digest. This is a wonder plant. I'm resisting people wanting to call it a superfood because superfoods are just things that other people sell to us and charge us twice as much for, like kale, eating digestible kale. Let's just call it food. Let's just call it Australian food. Let's just have our own cuisine, the cuisine of this country, and let's learn how to cook it from Aboriginal people. Now, not every Aboriginal person knows the history of their grandfathers and their great-great-grandfathers and their great-great-grandmothers. That is not our fault. We didn't invite this lack of knowledge onto ourselves. Like our languages, it was taken from us. But that's not the end of the story, and I'm not going to turn this into a poor fellow me sort of story, because we're in the present now, and we're looking towards the future, or we ought to be as a country. And it's important for us to revere our land, the land of Australia, to recognise its history and to recognise what it wants to do. And we have to care for the land. Let's not plough the mallee anymore. Let's grow in the mallee what the mallee wants to grow. Let's utilise those old domesticates of Aboriginal people, the yams, the grasses, all of those things. Let's utilise them. And in utilising those plants, we'll also be protecting our soils, because most of those plants are perennial. You don't need to plough them. The farmers in the audience will be saying, oh, I've seen kangaroo grass seed, it's tiny. Yes, of course it's tiny. It's an Australian seed. And the thing about it is that you can turn it into flour. You can graze the stubble if you want to graze animals. And it has a root mass that protects the soil, a massive root mass, and it sequesters carbon. When Australian governments decide that they really do want to protect the planet, they'll be paying farmers to grow perennial plants, because that is what will protect our soil. That is what will help us meet our carbon emission targets. These plants are going to be very important for us. And the fact that we're now starting to have this discussion means that we can have an adult conversation about Australia and its history. And next time we find that Aboriginal kids aren't reading well, that Aboriginal kids have ear, nose and throat complaints, we'll send in a nurse and we'll send in a school teacher. We won't send in the army. Wouldn't that be wonderful? We will send nurses and school teachers to teach those who need to be nursed and taught. And a percentage of those people will be Aboriginal people, because I've seen them. I've seen those kids going through university, through the upper levels of education. I've seen those Aboriginal kids, and I'm very, very proud of them. And I'm looking forward to turning up to the classrooms where they teach. I'm looking forward to going to the doctor's surgeries where they're treating people. I'm looking forward to having an Aboriginal nurse take my pulse and look after me. I'm looking forward to this future where Aboriginal people will be a normal part of Australian civilisation. Civilisation is a word that Europeans invented to describe themselves. They weren't trying to talk about other people. They were trying to describe themselves to create a benchmark below which everyone else fitted. And so they decided that the markers of civilisation were agriculture, pottery, spirituality, food storage. And they claimed then that other peoples whose land they lusted after fell below that standard. And the popes, after Columbus had so-called discovered America, they decided that they had to find a way of talking about the occupation of those lands. And they instituted a papal bull called the Doctrine of Discovery, 1493. And it said that when Europeans sailed across the oceans and came to a new land, a desirable new land, a land with wealth for toil, a land that could be productive for Europeans, where the riches of minerals and soil could make billionaires out of people very quickly. The justification for taking that land was if those people resisted the word of Jesus Christ, then they were savages. And savages, if they resisted the advance of Christians, could be killed and their lands taken. That's what the papal bull was all about. And it kept on being repeated and refined and more sophisticated. And that is how Europeans sailed across the world, taking land after land after land, continent after continent, until finally came to Australia, where the skills of colonisation were so refined that they had become a razor's edge. And colonialism in Australia was so refined that years later, South Africans would look at the Queensland justice system and invent apartheid based on Queensland tactics of controlling Aboriginal people. This is our country. We don't have to live like this. No point feeling guilty. John Howard was right. You can't be guilty for the past, but you are responsible for the future. We all are. Aboriginal people can't sit on their hands and say it's up to white fellas, because we'll all wait forever if we leave it to white politicians to fix. We will wait forever. It's not going to happen. We, the people, have to take the future into our own hands and insist that politicians do our bidding. We might need to let them think it's their own idea. That's how politics works. Like solar power. Eventually, some Prime Minister is going to say, we're going to solar power Australia, our country. And they'll have a sonorous voice and they will have a beautiful suit and tie. Well, let them think it, because we've already done it. Against all the government's great efforts, Australians are adopting solar power. The government have resisted it time and time again, flattering the coal companies or being flattered by the coal companies and investing in the coal industry that the rest of the world has abandoned. And in Australia, we're still talking about clean coal. We actually haven't invented the technology for clean coal, but we talk about it. And in the face of all this, the Australian people have adopted solar technology. Look at new housing estates and you'll see how all the roofs of at least a third of the houses have got solar panels on it, because the people have spoken. The people want solar power. The government doesn't want it. Eventually, some politician is going to drive past one of those housing estates and think, look at all those solar panels. The people want solar power. And they'll make it their policy and they'll get elected. And we don't know what party they're going to come from. It depends on who is in the car driving at the time and who looks up and who thinks this is what the people want. We will give it to them. That's how politics works. And we ought to be insisting that our politicians do for us what is so blindingly obvious. We should be knocking on their door, turning up at their electoral offices and saying, why aren't you donkeys adopting solar power in a country with more sunshine than any other country on earth? Why are we digging up the ground for a product that is killing the globe? Aren't we going to take some responsibility for the world's pollution? That's what we need to do as a people. And when we've done that, or while we're doing that, I hope we say, why don't we look at the plants that actually want to grow in Australia and stop using the superphosphate that is owned by half a dozen people in the world who have been made billionaires on the back of it? Why don't we say, why don't we grow Australian plants that need no fertiliser, because they're developed in these soils, these traditionally poor Australian soils, oldest continent on earth, all that sort of business. We can't do anything about the soil, it is what it is. But Aboriginal people selected the plants that grew productively in those soils and domesticated the ones that produce most food. Aboriginal people changed the nature of the botany of Australia, there's no doubt about it. Not just with burning, but also with domestication of plants. Let's turn back to those plants, because they don't need fertiliser, they don't need a lot of water, they need no pesticide, and they don't need a lot of tractor work. So you take the tractor off the land, you don't dig the soil as often, and you leave the carbon in there, and you leave the massive root masses of these plants, you leave that there in the soil to protect the soil, to conserve moisture, and to produce this incredible energy in the plants. Now, farmers might be shaking their heads, but some farmers are nodding their heads because they're trying it. And they've found that they can make a living out of making food this way. Not necessarily easy, but farming never was easy. Farming is always hard work. Imagine those Aboriginal people who Sir Thomas Mitchell saw how hard they must have worked to create a paddock of Murnong that stretched from Williamstown to Adelaide. It is probably the biggest agricultural field on earth. Was then, would be now, if it was still there. And those people worked really hard and systematically. The harvest that George Augustus Robinson saw on that soil was systematic and prolonged and dedicated labour, because those tubers weren't just for tonight's meal, they were to be stored, preserved. This was thinking about tomorrow, one of the things that Australian history claims Aboriginal people never did. And you know what Mitchell said when he saw all this productive activity? He saw this beautiful field of yellow flowers stretching to the horizon. He said it was as if God had prepared this land especially for him. Now, how's that for ego? And how is it for ignorance? Having witnessed Aboriginal people involved in the harvest of these plants, to think that God had made it for one man. And that's how Australian history runs. We've got to get over this nonsense. We've got to look through this nonsense. Mitchell called it Australia Felix. I bet you every Australian student has heard the words Australia Felix, but they've never heard the words stoop, tilling, terracing. We have to revolutionise our education. If you're a history teacher and you teach a boring history lesson to any Australian student, I'll come up and kick him in the ankle, because it's not necessary. It's unnecessary. Go into your classroom, read out those passages to your Australian students and ask them, what's going on? There's this man, first European to come onto this land, doesn't matter which one it is, say it's Mitchell, and he rides through 9 miles of stooped grain. Ask an 8-year-old, what's going on? Because I think the 8-year-old is the moral arbiter of the world. We should listen to them more often. What's going on? And the kids will go, well, someone was there before. Someone harvested that grain and stood on end. It's just logical. And you, the teacher, should say, yes, my 8-year-old, you are correct. Someone was there before. They had organised this field. They had harvested and they'd stood it on end. But the adults from 1840 on, or whenever the curriculum of Australia began to be formulated, failed to mention it. Failed to mention it at all. And we've lived in this stupid adolescence ever since. I reckon we can do something about that. I'm hoping we can, because our planet deserves our thought. And Aboriginal people, if I may, beg permission from my Murray brothers and sisters up there to speak in the language, Yuin language of my own family. And I've asked for this permission before from several groups in southern Queensland. I also in the Argentine, we all rise from the mother's heartbeat. We come from the earth. And it doesn't matter where I go in Australia, all Aboriginal people refer to the earth as their mother. And we have to treat the earth as if she was our mother, because that's what Aboriginal people did. They didn't talk about their future generations and their domination of the globe. They talked about caring for Mother Earth, because that's all they had. And they knew, as experienced astronomers, that that's all they had, that there was just this earth for their habitation, and that they had to look after it. And if we forget that, then we deserve to lose it. You know, people keep on talking about, you know, destroying the earth with plastic and pollution, but it's okay. We've got a spaceship. We can go to Mars. Well, I'll be waving goodbye to you because I'm staying here. This is my mother here, and I love her. I really love her. I'm staying with her. And I think we can do something about how we're destroying this planet, how we're polluting fish with bellies full of plastic. We can do something about all of these things. If we can invent plastic, we can uninvent it. We can clean it up. But we can't do it if we allow the moguls of capitalism to continue to have their way. We can say to those moguls, or whatever they are, you know the people I mean, they're the people who don't pay tax in Australia. We can say to them, yeah, you can continue to make money from Australians and from the rest of the world, but you can't do it at the expense of the earth. If you invent something say a Coca-Cola bottle. If you invent a Coca-Cola bottle, we will let you. But you have to pick up the Coca-Cola bottle. If you sell sugary hamburgers to people and you design a logo for the bag so that every time that bag is dropped in the street, people see the logo and think, oh yeah, sugary hamburger, I'll go and get one of them. We have to say to people, we will let you make money on the back of Australian people, but you've got to pick up the bag. And it would be a hell of a lot better if you wrap that hamburger in one bit of paper, not put it in a foam box. All of these things are within our capability, aren't they? We know they are, and yet we just don't do it. It's about time we Australians got interested in politics. We brag about being disinterested in politics, and I've done it, and I continue to do it, because I think it's the most boring craft on earth. But we have to involve ourselves, because the people that we allow off the leash to run our politics are feathering their nests at the expense of the earth. And we have to invite that politician to drive down the street and see how people are taking up solar power. And we have to teach kids that if they're going to eat sugary hamburgers, that they have to pick up their own paper. If they're going to eat drink a drink that is 70% sugar, then they have to pick up the cup that it comes in. All of these things are important, and they're part of history. This is not just an aberration from an old man who barracks for Richmond and therefore is a bit disappointed today. These are things that we all know to be true. These are truths. We need to look after our earth. And learning our history, Australian history, would help us enormously. I've finished up a bit quick, so I'm a storyteller. I'll tell you a story, more stories from the Aboriginal past that were recorded by those people, those Europeans that first went into country. And Aboriginal people are accused of having no interest in technology. And one of the first Europeans, a fellow called Kirby, that entered the lands around Swan Hill. And he and his mate did a lot of murdering there. But on one of his first days in the country, he noticed an Aboriginal man on the bank of a weir. That weir, Kirby reluctantly admitted, had been built by Aboriginal people right across the river. And this fellow had a long, whippy stick, a big boom, and there was a line attached to it which was pegged to the river floor, and it was in front of a little aperture in the weir wall into which a noose had been fitted. And every time a fish went through that noose, it released a peg, which released the noose, which then the whippy stick brought up out of the water and deposited that fish at the feet of the man on the weir bank. And Kirby said that the man was fishing in an incredibly lazy manner. And yet he had witnessed an extraordinary feat, an extraordinary technological feat. And he said in his own journal, he said, I'd heard coming out to Australia that Aboriginal people were lazy and worthless people, and seeing a man fishing in such a lazy manner, I realised that what I'd heard was true. He witnessed a feat of engineering. He was looking at a weir that stretched right across the river, and yet he referred to the people who had built it as being lazy and incompetent. That's how far his mind had been twisted into making excuses for his occupation of that soil. He was there, standing there that morning, learning to smoke cigarettes. He was only 19 years old. Because most of the people had been subdued, as he referred to it, murdered, as other people refer to it, and any judge would refer to it as murder. That was his right to occupy the soil. But the people who had been there, mostly were dead. And there's an extraordinary photograph of an Aboriginal fishing machine in Queensland, which was taken by Donald Thompson, a really unusual man. Took an unusual interest in what Aboriginal people were doing. And Donald Thompson took some of the best photographs ever been taken in Australia to this day. They're extraordinary things, and it's worth your while, I think, if you can get hold of a copy of these photographs, to purchase them. They're brilliant things. But Thompson took a photograph of a fence that had been built across a river, and 2 holes had been let into that fence so that the water could go through it. They came through 2 paper bark tubes into 2 paper bark drums. Those drums were built onto a platform which had been built on top of stumps that had been driven into the riverbed. 2 men were inside those drums so that every fish that came through the tubes as the water went downstream, those fish fell into the drums. The people selected the fish, and when they had enough fish, they then opened a chute in the bottom of the floor so that the water and the fish could proceed on their journey. This was an incredible machine. You can't think about it in any other terms. You know, why do we call it a fish trap? Why don't we call it a fishing machine? Why do we call the bread that Aboriginal people made damper? Why do we use the diminutive word when referring to these things? Because it's Aboriginal achievement. We don't want to call it bread. We don't want to call it machine because Aboriginal people did it. And we claim that the people that we took the land from had no claim over the earth, didn't really deserve the land, were barely human. Here they are, in reality, our old people making machines. It's an incredible bit of engineering, like our houses, that some of the explorers said you could ride a horse over. So heavily had they been constructed. Mostly they were dome houses. The dome is an incredibly strong shape in architecture. And it's seen all around the world because everybody was capable of thinking of these things, but Aboriginal people thought of them first. We invented bread and we invented the dome because we now know that the oldest villages on earth were in Australia. Forget Turkey. Don't forget Turkey. They were pretty good at building, just that they came to it fairly late because Aboriginal people were the first people to live in villages. So not only did we invent bread, we also invented society. And when Australians start to think about that, start to think, say, about the Warrazum fish traps, which some scientists say are the oldest human construction on Earth. The oldest human construction on Earth. How many Australians take their holidays to Warrazum? How many overseas people are encouraged to come and see the oldest human construction on Earth? What kind of country are we? How much do we revere our country? How much do we revere our history? Because here, these are some of the high points of human civilization. They occur in this country. And people in the future are going to make millions of dollars out of these things. And I hope a good proportion of those people are Aboriginal. Because surely Australia is not going to dispossess Aboriginal people twice. It's within the capability of this country of Australia, this democracy, this Christian democracy, to make sure that after all the years of talking about closing the gap. Little children are sacred, that we can allow Aboriginal people to take part in this industry. We can encourage Aboriginal people to take part in this industry of tourism and of agriculture, so that an economy can develop, an Aboriginal economy that matches the Aboriginal economy of the past. All of these things are within our capability, and places like Warrazum will become famous in the world because they are such fundamentally important places for the development of human society. And if we can swallow the pill of our history, then we will learn that these places are of world importance. Once they become known in the world, surely we can accept the fact that this land is not terra nullius. This land was the fount of human existence. And we can argue about the out of Africa theory and all of that sort of thing. But there's a midden at Warrnambool in Victoria that's 80,000 years old. I was there the other day and I was saying to one of the archaeologists, isn't it incredible that it's 80,000 years old? And they said, well, we've done a bit more work. We think it might be 120,000 years. 120,000 years. When the Warrazum fish traps were being studied to find out how old they were, a politician decided that all the money that was being devoted to Aboriginal museums, Aboriginal archaeology was no longer necessary. So all that money was withdrawn. The research stopped halfway through. And so in this country, this Australia, when we were examining a structure that could be argued was the oldest human structure on Earth, we stopped it so we could give someone a tax cut. We need to reform this. We need to tell our politicians that they are culpable, that they are responsible, and that we are watching. And if we do that, we can truly learn to love our country. It's not about putting on a black armband. It's not about feeling guilty. It's about acknowledging the truth and about feeling Australian, feeling like we belong in this country. Because, I know there will be Aboriginal brothers and sisters shake their head when I say that. But what are the two realities of Australian history in the present? Aboriginal people aren't going to go anywhere. We're staying here. This is our country. But the same can be said of non-Aboriginal people. They're not going anywhere either. So we have to get on with each other. But it is the responsibility of non-Aboriginal people, I believe, to recognise the real history of the country and not pretend that the land was taken from our people because we didn't deserve it. Our land was taken from us because we didn't own weapons. And our spirituality forbade us from taking land from other people. That was our spirituality. And that's why our languages stayed in the same locations for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, because we didn't lust for land. We were born responsible for a particular piece of land, and that was our heritage. And that was what we had to look after. Our whole life was devoted to looking after the land. The land wasn't responsible to look after us. We were responsible for looking after the land. And we didn't know about land war. We didn't believe in land war. It hadn't entered our consciousness to take land from others, because the law, as made by those old intellectuals, those old people 100,000 years ago, or whenever it was that everybody would have a house, everybody would get fed, everybody would take part in the culture, and when old, everybody would be looked after by the young. That was the law. It wasn't the law of the sword. It was the law of Mother Earth. And it's easy to smile, laugh up your sleeve at a concept like that. But think about it for a minute. It's absolute rigour. Because those old people knew that they were manufacturing government for a flawed animal, the human who can be kind and generous, but can also be violent and cruel and selfish. So the government was created for the human. And that government was a piece of genius because it didn't talk about war. Whereas all governments ever since always have armies, always anticipate war, and never anticipate conciliation. I think it's an incredible development in the human story. Like the fish traps and like the old villages, it's something that Australia can take pride in. We should take pride in, but we should also make sure that Aboriginal people are part of this future. If we're going to accept the fact that we're all going to have to live here together with each other, then surely it's within the capability of this nation to ensure that Aboriginal people are part of the future, part of the economic future, part of the cultural future, part of the spiritual future. Because this is one hell of a development here. This is one of the most extraordinary cultures on earth. I would say the most extraordinary cultures on earth. And a lot can be learnt from it. We're not a museum. We're not quaint. We're not to be patted on the head. Oh, you wise and spiritual people. None of that. Just go, you muscular brains, you intellectuals, what your old people had was a flower of civilization. And we will not trample it. We will learn from it and we will use it. We will use the food, we will use the philosophy, we will use the spirituality. Bless you. And you will be part of it. We insist that as 97% of the population, we insist that you take prominence in this cultural development. We insist that you sit beside us as our elders. I don't think I'm talking pie in the sky either, because I think the world's in such a state now that these kind of sentiments will no longer be seen as looking through rose-tinted glasses, but seen as hard muscularity of survival. We need it, and we know we bloody need it.
Thank you, Bruce, and I think you can gather by our audience reaction the impact that your words have had. So thank you very much.
Good on you.
Okay, all the best. And of course, Bruce's book, Dark Emu, Black Seeds, is his latest book, and that's available. I'm not sure of the publisher, but I'm sure if you can look for it online, you'll find that one there.